Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our international virtual fireside chat for the Middle East. We're so excited to have you join us. This evening, we'll be having Ambassador and Vice Provost Stephen Mull, Professor David Leblang, and Ambassador Barbara Leaf. We're very excited to have them this evening. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a quick housekeeping items. I'm Margaret Chopade. I'm the Senior Associate Director for the UVA Clubs and Global Engagement in our Office of Advancement. This is a wonderful collaboration between the UVA Clubs team and the Office of Global Affairs. So we're really excited to have you and to be able to host you this evening. A couple quick things before we get started. This program will be recorded and will be shared on the UVA Club's webpage and social media. So just something to keep in mind as you engage and participate, that this will be shared. We would love to know who's here tonight. So if you don't mind going down to the chat box and letting us know who's here with your name, how you're affiliated to the university, maybe what you're up to. We love to hear from you. We also will have a live Q&A, which will have a Q&A box, which you should also see in your Zoom box below, where you can type in a question. And we'll also have a time where you can raise your hand, which you should be able to see in your participation window, where if you raise your hand, then we will actually unmute you and be able to let you ask that question to our panelists live. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Steve Mull, who will also be introducing our other two panelists tonight. Steve is our Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of Virginia. Through this role, he's the primary lead on global relations at the university, is responsible for developing strategic vision, designing outreach, and overseeing international activities. Steve is responsible for overseeing institutional development of global partnerships and developing a wide array of services, programs, experiences, and strategic partnerships that promote global imagination within the university community. Steve joined the university in August of 2018 after a 36-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, which included serving as acting Under Secretary for Political Affairs, implementation of the Iran nuclear deal, and service as ambassador to Poland and Lithuania. So Steve, Ambassador and Vice Provost Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Maggie, and just a warm welcome and greeting to all of you in the Middle East joining us there tonight. We're so excited to get together in our extended UVA community in really one of the most important regions of the world. And I'm especially glad to have on our panel tonight Ambassador Barbara Leaf, a longtime colleague in the U.S. State Department, and Professor David Leblang, who I look forward to introducing both of them to you later. As Maggie mentioned, I've been here at UVA for almost 2 years now, with a simple instruction from our president, Jim Ryan, to up our global engagement as a university with the world. And our UVA clubs and alumni and friends and family around the world are such an integral part of raising our global profile in the world. So I'm so happy to be able to have meetings like this, and I hope we can do it again regularly. And I also hope to visit with you, many of you, if we can ever get back on airplanes again. I certainly look forward to coming out to the region and spending some time with you going forward. President Ryan, when he hired me, said, you really need to do one thing. I want you to make it possible for every single undergraduate student here at UVA to have a global experience before graduation. And so that's been the focus of my effort here. As many of you know who've been here, the study abroad tradition, especially over the past 15 or 20 years, has been an increasingly important part of our global engagement. Last year, we counted about just over 40% of our students who had some international travel and international study during their time here. So we're looking to grow those opportunities, principal through financial assistance and developing tailored programs. It used to be study abroad meant going to Florence for a semester. It doesn't mean that at all, although you still can if you want. But it's really about creating a variety of experiences, the J term, summer, spring break. We really have all varieties and are developing ever more of them for study abroad for our students. An important part of it is experiential learning, and we're developing some innovative new programs that sends our students abroad not just to sit in a classroom overseas, but to also get their hands dirty with some practical experience working for NGOs, for businesses, and other organizations, so they can apply the knowledge that they learn on the ground. We've also developed a pretty good global internship program that every year creates about 60 opportunities for our students to get practical, academically oriented internship experience overseas. So all of these things are growing. We also are keen to grow our international profile here on grounds. Last year, about 5% of our incoming undergraduate class was from international destinations. That's actually kind of low compared to most of our peer institutions. And so over the next few years, pandemics permitting, visa policies permitting, and so forth, we aim to increase the number of international students here on grounds. And we look to work with you all out in regions around the world to help us identify and bring promising students to join us here. And then finally, an important part of being a global institution is having a global atmosphere on grounds, and we're so lucky to be so close to Washington, where it's a source of just an enormous number of opportunities to bring practitioners here to grounds to spend time on with our students and with our faculty. Just in the past year alone, we've had more than 10 important ambassadors come to UVA to spend time giving lectures, participating in panel discussions. And so we're looking to increase opportunities like that. Now, as I'm sure all of you can appreciate, the past few months has been quite a challenge on the global front, not only for us here at UVA, but at higher education institutions around America. Back in March, when it became quite rapidly apparent the risk that all of us were going to be facing, we had to make a decision to bring home about 400 UVA students who were studying abroad at the time and move, and Professor Leblang will be able to attest to this, move in very short order from in-classroom instruction to completely online instruction in the space of about 10 days, starting during spring break back in March. We had to come up with plans to move over 4,000 classes from an in-person experience to online. And it's really quite extraordinary that we were able to do it. It wasn't perfect. There were a few glitches here and there, but we learned a lot about how to do it. And I think we're going to get better and better. And so there's the old saying that don't ever let any crisis go to waste. It's actually been a good opportunity to improve our resilience and our ability to operate on all sorts of different platforms in reaching out to the world. Going forward to the fall, obviously, as you can see in the newspaper, the pandemic, unfortunately, isn't going anywhere in the US. In fact, it only seems to be getting worse, or best case scenario, staying at a steady state. So we've been confronted with a number of challenges in preparing for the fall semester. A couple of weeks ago, President Ryan sent a message out to all of our students and our broader UVA community, laying out what those assumptions are. We are going to start on time on August 25th with a mix of in-person classes as well as online classes. The larger classes will be online until we believe it's safe for them not to be. We are particularly sensitive to the challenges of international students. Visa sections, as all of you I'm sure know, at US embassies and consulates around the world have effectively been closed since March, and we don't have any idea about when they're going to be giving visas again. Additionally, travelers from China, Europe, Brazil, and Iran are unable to cross the border into the United States. So it's put a real kink in our efforts to attract the international population that's so important to us. So in recognition of that, President Ryan made a commitment that all of our students will be guaranteed online instruction until such time as they can make it here to grounds, whenever that will be, when visas are being issued and borders are fully opened again. But I'll tell you, we want to keep developing that resilience and responsiveness. So if you all are aware of issues that our international students from your region are having, please write to me and let me know. We want to make sure we do everything possible to keep our students engaged. The semester in-person instruction, to the extent that we're doing it, will end at Thanksgiving. After that, it will be completely online. And then for the spring, we'll see how things look. We work very closely with the Virginia Department of Health and Education, and we collaborate very closely with all of the other universities here in Virginia to make sure that we are operating consistently in terms of making these sorts of decisions. We've introduced a new degree of flexibility to make it easier, to make a very unusual experience easier for all of our students. So for paying the regular tuition fee for next year, you can structure your experience, your academic year in a much more flexible way. You can take fewer classes, you can stay home if you don't want to come to Charlottesville in the fall, take some classes online. We will be opening up significantly expanded course offerings during the J term, the 2-week term in January, that students will be able to take classes without any extra charge. We'll also expand our classes in the earlier part of the summer next year. So you could take a few classes online in the fall, do a J term, do a full spring load, additional courses in the early summer, and complete all 30 credits of an academic year in the configuration that works best for you. We also are going to have some significant challenges with our residence halls and classrooms. We will be maintaining social distancing rules. Everyone will have to wear a mask in the classroom. Students in dormitories will be assigned same sinks and showers and other facilities that they will be assigned to those specific pieces. So it's going to be quite a challenge, but we're going to have extensive orientation for all of our students and faculty when they're back in the fall, laying out the rules. Going forward, obviously, it's hard to get on a plane these days for various reasons. Students, after the experiences of the past few months, are not particularly eager to travel and study abroad, but we've noticed still a passionate interest in globally oriented education. As we were ramping up, or rather ramping down our study abroad programs in the spring, in fact, we had the highest number ever of applicants for our global studies major in the college, and all of the students we engage with seem absolutely committed to getting a global education and remaining globally engaged. So as we get through these challenges over the next year, or who knows how long it will take, the pressure is going to be on us to find different avenues to have that global experience. I won't get into all the details here, but we'll be looking to expand opportunities for professors to link with counterparts overseas to co-teach courses, to mixed classes of US students and international students, which we think we've tried on a pilot basis in a few courses this past year. And it's actually quite exciting and interesting. And we're all becoming much more skilled at Zoom, as I'm sure all of you are. The technology benefits of this make it a lot easier to engage, and better yet, you can do it without getting on an airplane and filling the environment with carbon and spending money to fly. In many ways, it's cheaper to have an international experience. So we'll be working hard to adapt, and again, we welcome engagement from you all and ideas. So I'll be happy to take questions on any of this later if you're interested in any further detail. But I don't want to do all the talking because we have such great panelists here, and I want to get to them. First, I'm so excited to introduce Ambassador Barbara Leaf, as I mentioned, a longtime colleague in the State Department. Like me, Ambassador Leaf left the Foreign Service in recent years, and today is director of the Gadult program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ambassador Leaf was ambassador to the United Arab Emirates from 2014 to 2018, and before that, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula, and also served in that capacity for Iraq. So Ambassador Leaf is one of the leading U.S. government experts on politics of the Arab world, and it's such a pleasure for all of us to be able to have her here. She's also worked in other places like Rome and Sarajevo and Paris and Cairo and Tunis, Jerusalem, and even Port-au-Prince in this hemisphere. But most importantly for all of us is Ambassador Leaf is an alumna of the University of Virginia. She got her master's degree in foreign affairs in 1984. Before I turn the floor to Ambassador Leaf, I also want to introduce David Leblang, Professor David Leblang, who is one of our most high-profile faculty members here at UVA. I don't know how he does it all. He's been here for about 12 years. He's in the politics department of the college. In fact, for several years was the chair of the politics department, and still teaches and plays a very active leadership role in the politics department. He's a faculty associate at our Miller Center on the Presidency, where he's a very active contributor to scholarship and programs on presidentially oriented issues. And on top of that, he's a member of the faculty at the Batten School of Public Policy and Leadership and Public Policy, where he is the director of the Center for Global Policy. So he's incredibly active. He's renowned as an expert on global financial markets, on transnational issues which dominate foreign affairs these days, such as the pandemic, migration, global flows of capital, and so forth. So we're really excited to have both of these very distinguished panelists with us today. Ambassador Leaf, if I could turn to you first to share your perspective on this crazy world and time we're living in right now. And then David will turn to you for the same, and then look forward to getting to your questions. But without further ado, Ambassador Leaf, over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's great to be here, and it's great to connect with folks who share my very deep connection and love for both UVA as well as the region that I've spent most of my career on, the Middle East. So Maggie asked me to sort of connect the dots in terms of my connection with UVA, how I got there, why I went, and then what I did later in life and how it relates to our current churn, which Steve described so eloquently. So I went to UVA as a sort of a stopping point on my march to the Foreign Service. I had taken the tests, passed them, and I knew from other colleagues that it would take about 2 years to pass through all the hoops, so security clearance and that sort of thing to get into the Foreign Service. So I thought, perfect time to do a master's, and my analytical skills, my writing skills and so forth, and just learn a lot more about the set of issues that really consumed me as an undergrad at William & Mary, which was the Soviet Union and the communist world at large. So I plunged in. And then when I got into the Foreign Service 2 years later, I really did a right turn and headed after my first 2 tours to Jerusalem, to the Middle East. And I won't say that I never looked back in terms of my prior studies, because even though with the sort of the crashing sound of the fall of the wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the breakup into all of these independent states, even amidst this sort of a notion that there was no longer a need to understand Russian foreign policy, defense policy, it lay there in the backdrop, even as I was working progressively through the Middle East and with occasional segues to Western Europe, to the Balkans and so forth. And of course, towards the end of my career, in the last 5 or 6 years of my career, Moscow came roaring back with a vengeance, specifically with its intervention into Syria, its military intervention in Syria and the Syrian conflict. And that's a set of issues that I think David and I can toss back and forth with some interesting sort of looks at how that crisis itself amplifies so much of what the Middle East has come to represent for the American public, for the American political, the policymaking elites, and frankly, for those in the think tankery universe, academia, who at this late stage are kind of sick to death of the Middle East. Even the Middle East experts in Washington are kind of sick of the region, all the problems, the conflicts, and the things that it keeps exporting to our doorstep. But I hold to the conviction, quite apart from my own love for the region and its culture, the languages, and the food and everything else, I do hold to the conviction that much as the region represents many negatives in terms of arms races and conflicts in Libya, Yemen, Syria, periodically in Iraq, human rights issues, non-proliferation challenges. With all of that said, the US retains some really strategic national security interests there, and we turn our back on the region at our own peril. So having coursed through the region and a few other sort of places on the rim, I ended my time in the Foreign Service in the spring of 18 and did a segue to the think tank world for what I thought would just be a stopping point until I kind of figured out what I wanted to do in my next chapter of life. But I ended up really enjoying both the setting that I was in, the Washington Institute, which is an institute that has for 35 years been wholly focused on the region, from North Africa to Iran, Turkey, and to Yemen, down to Yemen. And I found a setting that I really enjoyed in terms of not just the expertise that could nurture my own intellectual curiosity, but also the opportunity to connect with universities, with sort of the next gen of the national security professionals. So I do a lot of recruiting, and I hope that everybody who's listening today is thinking, at least in one part of their brain, of the possibility of going into public service. But as I say, the issues that are before us as a country in this pandemic seem squarely domestic, economic, health, how to get our society back on its feet, how to really tackle forthrightly longstanding issues of economic and racial inequities and so forth. And all of that is true. But again, I think we at our peril, turn our back on the world, whether it's the Middle East or Europe or China as it rises to preeminence. We must stay interconnected. We have to find that balancing where we reinvest more heavily into our own people, our own institutions, but retain that connection, the diplomatic connections in particular, and the business, the trade connections overseas. And those of you who've been or either in the UAE or have passed through it will know what I mean when I say there are many bright spots out there in the region, and there are countries and societies who are trying to get on the move or are on the move and are determined to be part of a much brighter future. So I'll stop there and pass the mic to David.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve and Maggie and Daniil, and nice to meet you, Barbara. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. In part, as I was saying to Steve and Barbara earlier, I'm not an expert on the Middle East. My work is as a political economist. So I spent the first part of my career writing papers and books focusing on global financial markets, asking questions about how do political institutions and political processes such as elections or changes in government influence the behavior of markets. And really interested in this process in a global fashion, thinking hard about the ways in which political information influence the kinds of decisions that investors make, and also how policymakers then attempt to try and shield their economies from what is often referred to or had been referred to as footloose capital. The idea that capital is able to move from one place to another with abandon. And when it leaves the United States, or when it leaves an emerging markets like Mexico, then it wreaks havoc on domestic financial institutions. I kind of concluded that set of work and started asking myself a hard question, which is, what do I do next? This is the question that academics often ask themselves when they finish a project. And I thought, I want to learn something about migration because, like capital, people move across borders, right? They don't move across borders with as great ease. They don't move across borders with as little resistance, but we still see a lot of human capital moving across borders. And I was interested in the ways in which the mobility of humans influences both host countries, but also homelands. And this is where I actually spent a little bit of time focusing on what's happening in the Middle East. A big part of what sending countries or homelands or countries of origin, whatever we want to call them, the origins of migrants have been engaged in for the last 20 years at least, is trying to become increasingly involved with their diasporas, with their populations living abroad. And that's because diasporas are important lobbyists for the homeland, right? So we see a lot of changes in EU policy or in EU country policy, US policy, Australian policy. That's a function of lobbying that's done by organized interests in those countries that oftentimes reflect the interest of diaspora groups. The second thing, and this is certainly important for large numbers of countries in the Middle East and around the world, is that diasporas are sources of financial capital. They send home billions of dollars in remittances. But migrants are also investors, right? And migrants know something about their homelands, and they can take advantage of the fact that they often have a comparative advantage in knowledge of the homeland when making investment decisions. And so that's formed a lot of my work over the last, I would say, 10 years. These days, I'm still doing that sort of work, but my interest in migration has really evolved because I'm thinking about migration domestically as well as internationally. And the reason I'm doing that is because, it is not unfamiliar to some people on this call. I'll call out Tahir Taprani, who's a student of mine, at least if it's the same Tahir Taprani, who's a student of mine last semester and is working on a project with us looking at internal displacement. And there are more people who are internally displaced in the world today than there are migrants living permanently in foreign countries and individuals who are refugees across borders. So internal displacement is a phenomena. It affects host countries, it affects homelands. And this is something where I think when we circle back to what Barbara was talking about, the transnational nature of COVID, for example, we also have to think about the impact that these transnational issues have on people who have been displaced from their homes, right? And again, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that later, but that's how I'm thinking about the world. It's when we're thinking about people who are vulnerable, really thinking hard about the people who have been moved or removed from the places that they know and hold dear to themselves, whether they're refugees, whether they are internally displaced people. So I'll pause there and look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, David. Before we go to the audience for questions, I would like to ask each of you some follow-up questions. Barbara, starting with you as one of the leaders of American diplomacy and remaining engaged with this region over the past 20 years, I'd be really interested in your thoughts about where we stand these days in terms of U.S. interests in the broader Middle East. U.S. policy has been pretty consistent through Republican and Democratic administrations going back 40, 50 years. But I think everyone can agree that we've actually changed some approaches over the past couple of years during the Trump administration by, on various fronts, such as stepping away from explicit support for a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. There's been a growing but discreet rapprochement between Israel and many of the Gulf Arab states where you spent part of your career. much closer U.S. collaboration with the Gulf Arabs. At the same time, substantially increasing tensions with Iran, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. So in the midst of all of these major changes from previous U.S. assumptions and approaches, how do you assess the overall impact of that on security in the regions and on U.S. interests in general?
Okay, well, that's a huge package of questions. I'm going to try to unpack them as best I can. I would say, because there's the sort of the outside, American perspective on ourselves, and then there's a perspective of those in the region. And let me just start with the Gulf countries, if I could. And mind you, it's a family of 6 countries, very different one from another. Family that's very deeply riven by a rift of 3 years standing, but one that goes back some years in its origins. So you can't really talk about them all having a uniformity of view of outlook, be it on Israel, Iran, etc. But what runs through all of them is, and it goes into a broader sense across the region, is this sinking sense that the U.S. is in fact progressively or even accelerating a departure from the Middle East. And this perspective has been there over the course of 3 presidencies now. Much as the George W. Bush 2 terms is viewed as having left an indelible mark on the region with the catastrophic invasion of Iraq, there was a sense growing in the region that deepened under the Obama administration, and it is there now in very stark form, that the U.S. has really lost interest through a combination of things. One, the election of Donald Trump with America First as its moniker seems to amplify this, that the U.S. is turning back inward. But earlier than that, the sort of the explosion of oil production in the U.S. through non-conventional means, the shale revolution, meant that old connection, oil from the Gulf in exchange for a U.S. security umbrella, might be shaken. And then most spectacularly last summer and fall, when there were a series of very thinly veiled, very thinly deniable attacks by Iran on Gulf energy infrastructure and shipping, ending most spectacularly in September with an attack on Saudi, the heart of the Saudi energy infrastructure. There was a sort of a collective gasp that the U.S. did not pile in and have a military or any other kind of response. Now, you can argue whether we should have or not, but the point is, that seemed to be a rupture point for what had been a 4 decades long doctrine adapted by every president, Republican or Democrat, going back to January of 1980, to the Carter Doctrine, where we would extend the security umbrella explicitly over these countries against external or internal to the region threats. So, and then you touched, Steve, on a very interesting piece, which is this rupture in terms of our, decades-long approach to the seemingly insoluble Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I would argue that this slow warming that has become more visible in the last couple of years, warming of non-traditional, non-official relations between key Gulf states and Israel, is something that sort of came about on its own. Of course, it has been encouraged by several administrations, and most clearly the Trump administration, but it had its own logic, which was a common threat perception vis-a-vis Iran. Less profound, but a common threat perception about extremism in the region and the threats that posed. And then a sort of like-mindedness in terms of appetite for technology, transfer and so forth, and learning from Israel in what it had done in terms of desert agriculture and so forth. But you were right in saying that we are at this point where the region looks, many parts of the region, the Iraq, the Gulf states, Egypt, and so forth, they look at the U.S. for reasons I don't quite understand, is having decided to kind of pivot away, whether it's to go back home, pivot to Asia, not clear. And that's side by side with still an enormous military component by the US out there. But it's rather the withering of our diplomatic engagement, as well as sort of the public rhetoric coming out of the administration.
Thanks. We need to get you back in government to get us more engaged, I think. David, I wonder, just sort of keeping on regional security issues in the Middle East, I think almost every observer would agree that one of the most earth-shaking developments, not only in the Middle East, but much more broadly of the past 10 years, has been the impact of the so-called Arab Spring starting in 2010, 2011, which over the past 10 years has just contributed to really earth-shaking changes, certainly most notably the horrible conflict in Syria. But not only that, has contributed to this massive outflow of migrants from the region into Europe, which we've seen has had an enormous impact on European security issues, an impact on the European identity, on the mission of the European Union. And it's kicked off, I think most would agree, a rising tide of nativism, fear of nationalism, a growing impatience with Europe's long-standing tradition of bringing in outsiders and of granting asylum. And of course, those factors have contributed more broadly beyond Europe, certainly having echoes here in the United States as well. So where do you see this going over the next 5 years? Do you believe that migration flows have now been effectively controlled? And if so, will that have effect on the security of the region? Where do you see the whole migration issue going over the next 5 years between the Middle East and Europe?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Every day that I look at the news and think about these border restrictions, I wonder whether everything I've studied for the last decade is now obsolete, right? Because we really are seeing very little mobility. But I also want to, before I get to the future, let me both acknowledge and appreciate how you began your question. A lot of people, I would say the majority of commentators, when they think about migration into Europe, think about the summer of 2015, and they think about the Syrian exodus. And I think that's exactly wrong, right? And I think, Steve, you got it exactly right when you talk about the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was not just a political movement in the north of Africa. It also unleashed is too strong of a word, but it also allowed for and contributed to an outflow of migrants. Again, you have to be cognizant of what's happening in the continent. There had been tremendous amount of displacement in Africa after decades of civil conflict and drought, when people were leaving sub-Saharan Africa and moving north, not just to Syria, but Morocco, Tunisia, etc., with eyes on getting into Europe. Right? And so what the Arab Spring did is that it allowed for, or it generated even more pressure moving out of sub-Saharan Africa, moving out of Africa and North Africa into Southern Europe, right? And Southern Europe, if you remember 2010, 2011, this is right after the heyday of the European financial crisis, right? The Great Recession. So you have European countries that are already fragile. Now you have an increase in migration, right? This is what laid the seeds for the populist backlash in Europe and in the United States. It wasn't just the Syrian conflict. And again, I just think that's important as we have this discussion. What's particularly interesting is when we look at the moment where we are, right? So fast forward to the present, and then thinking about what things look like next year. migration plays such a vital role in the economic lives, not just of sending countries. As I said before, remittances are the lifeblood for so many countries, but for destination countries, right? I mean, if you've been to Europe, you see migrants, not just from Eastern European or other European countries, but from the Middle East, from Asia, doing a lot of, a lot of labor, right? So and I'm not talking about low skilled versus high skilled, I'm saying that they're a large part of the workforce. If we look at the Middle East, the stories about migration in the Middle East that come out really focus on migrant labor that's doing a lot of domestic work and a lot of construction work, right? So closing the doors or keeping the doors closed to that labor force, it's just not sustainable as countries begin to try and recover economically from a catastrophic health and economic crisis. So my gut here, Steve, and again, I wear my optimism on my sleeve, right? My hope, I should say, and my expectation is that we're going to see these border controls coming down to some extent, even the United States. Right, Donald Trump, who has made a central feature of his presidency to restrict immigration, all the stuff that's coming out still has exceptions for low-skilled labor, right? For agricultural workers, for seasonal workers, migration is essential, right? And I would argue that migration is essential across the board, but I think as countries begin to recover, there will be an increased need for large amounts of labor to come in, if not just in healthcare, but certainly across the board.
Steve, if I could jump in.
Please, Barbara.
No, David's just made some great points that you really have to go backward in time to see the roots of sort of the fruit that has been born in these last 10 years, starting with the explosion of the protests, with a fruit vendor, a fruit vendor in Tunisia who, in utter despair, immolated himself and triggered this hopscotching across the region from December of 2010 all the way till now, with the Syria conflict still burning. But in looking at Syria recently for a series of talks I was doing, I mean, Syria's own time bomb started in just absolutely uncontrolled birth rates in the 70s and late 70s and 80s, which then coincided with climate change driven desertification, migration into cities, and then this dry set of kindling was just set aflame, and all of those young men and women that surged into the streets from Dera to Aleppo, etc. These were the generation that had grown up from that time bomb, that birth demographic time bomb. And so it's a region, if I don't even go southward into Africa, but into the Middle East, it is people do call it a demographic time bomb. The more optimistic way to look at it is it's an incredibly young population across the board, 60% or greater under 30 across these countries. But exactly as David says, this being hemmed in by borders and now by pandemics, it creates its own set of pent-up energies and fuses that can be lit.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful point, Barbara. When I meet students here at UVA who are interested in following in our footsteps in diplomatic service, they always ask for advice, and I always tell them, I wish I had learned this lesson at the beginning of my career. It's so important to get historical perspective on all of these problems because you're not going to have any hope of solving any of them unless you have some idea about what people's collective experience and memories of these issues, and God knows that's certainly true in this region of the world. Maggie, I wonder if we could go to you, if you could start throwing forward some questions from our audience.
Absolutely, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, we're going to open the live Q&A. There are two ways we can do that. As I mentioned earlier, we have the Q&A box, and then you can actually raise your hand over under the participations tab. There should be a raised hand, and we'll get to you live. Our first question we have is from Alexandra. And so I'm going to, Alexandra, I'm going to give you the opportunity to be able to unmute. I think it'll work. We're going to try it. I think it might not work. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the question for Alexandra. And her question is, how do our panelists think COVID might impact the geopolitics as countries, as they seem to be turning inwards and becoming more isolationist and nationalist?
Yeah, I can take it. Let me take an initial swing. And again, I take the swing acknowledging that things are unfolding in real time, right? I mean, we've seen the Europeans just yesterday decrease travel restrictions, at least as they pertain to some countries. All right, and so I think that's interesting. There's another dimension here that I think is kind of going under the wire, but I think is really important, and I'd be curious to for Steve and Barbara's perspective on this. So when COVID outbreaks really started taking off in March and April, I made a claim in a class I was teaching, and I was dead wrong. All right, I just don't want to admit that. My claim was that we would very soon see a debt crisis because COVID was going to hit emerging markets. These emerging markets were going to have economic failures. There was going to be recessions. And as a consequence, they would be unable to repay outstanding debt to their debtors, to their creditors. What I did not anticipate was that creditor nations would come together so rapidly to provide either relief or extensions for almost all of the debtor countries. Now, again, I don't know how long that's going to last, but that was an economic move that I was really quite surprised about. It showed a level of cooperation and coordination that, were it not to have occurred, we would be in the midst of a global depression and not just a substantial recession in advanced countries. So that's an area where I said there's some happiness, if you will, right? I mean, there's a bright side, but I'm curious about what you all think of that.
So, the way I've looked at it, and again, I'll stay within the strictures, the bounds of the Middle East for the moment, but, we can roam more widely if people are interested. The thing that is really, that's sort of been, there's been a sort of a double-headed black swan, if you will. So there's been the pandemic itself, and then you had from March to April, about a month of this unlooked for, very unwelcome bolt from the blue, which was this price war, oil production war by Vladimir Putin and the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. So I say it's a double-headed black swan because, of course, nobody could have foreseen, other than health experts and national security experts who follow pandemics for their life's work, but people in the region elsewhere that couldn't have foreseen that literally out of nowhere comes this pandemic that has a devastating economic and other effects across the region, but then is, the shock to oil demand globally was then met by a shock to oil supply because of this price war. So it deepened the damage across the region and the oil producing nations, including most perilously countries like Iraq, which is 95% for its revenues dependent on oil. So a very undiversified economy, but even in the Gulf, they were shellacked by this as well. And why does that matter? They have tiny populations, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, where it's really much more problematic, a set of shocks. They have tiny populations. They have traditionally had deep pockets, with the exception of Bahrain, Oman, and they've used those deep pockets to stabilize countries in the aftermath or during an aftermath of the Arab Spring. So Egypt, Jordan, and others. but those pockets aren't so deep now. And they have got to actually look at their own economic model, which are these tiny populations with a, anywhere from 70 to 90% of the overall country population being foreign labor. So is that a sustainable model going forward? Are we already, seeing the, the shift away from, peak oil as the term goes? So, I mean, I just see that there will be many ripples, coming out from these sets of shocks that we cannot really even begin to get our arms around. But it certainly in the near term, there's a high potential for further instability. And this is where, we haven't mentioned it, but I'll just say, this is where, my God, we need some US leadership to help corral collective action to stabilize such countries. And I think to Alexandra's question, I think there will be a tendency for many countries in Europe, in the US, elsewhere, to be looking inward to our own housekeeping. But there will be regions like the Middle East and parts of Africa, Latin America, which will badly need the sort of external help in stabilizing things.
I might just add, thanks, Barbara and David. Alexandra, your question is so pertinent. Just sitting here in Charlottesville, since the outbreak of the pandemic, we can see all of the negative things that come along with pandemics that have happened throughout history, going back to the bubonic plague in the 14th century and even before. That pandemics tend to bring out the worst in people. People are afraid. They become fearful of foreigners or anyone who's different. And that very quickly bubbles up into all sorts of social ills that we've been seeing throughout this, not only here in the United States, but elsewhere. We had issues, we have like many higher American institutions of higher education in America, a substantial Asian population here at UVA. Many of those students felt as if they were stigmatized. People would yell at them on the street saying, "Take your virus out of here." And so having to deal with that is very worrying and trying. But like David, I'll wear my optimism on the sleeve too, on my sleeve too. We're only going to solve this by transcending the borders and differences. Certainly, our scientists need to be collaborating around the world. That's the only way we're going to fix this, that we're going to solve the challenge of developing a vaccine. The economic front, we need central banks around the world responding, as David mentioned, that they have. And even our immigration policies, if we're going to shut down travel around the world, we shouldn't be doing that unilaterally. We need to do it with our allies and partners to make sure we approach this in an integrated way. And those policies will be the most effective. And so I think most people in their intellects, once they get beyond the emotion and the fear, realize that. And I think we'll have these blips of closing down borders and looking to stigmatize outsiders. But I think it's going to be temporary. We have to do this together.
Great. We have another question from one of our attendees. Kakate, we're going to try this one more time to see if we can have this question live. And you have been given permission to speak, if you'd like to try.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can. Yay!
It worked.
Well, nice to see the grounds in the background. It's been a while. Have you read my question?
Is it under the Q&A? Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes. So Kagate asked, how could we describe the real source of anti-migrant stance? Is it just terrorism, racism, fact today's migrants or tomorrow's lobbyists, which seem to be the factor affecting U.S. policies on international relations, according to some public opinion? A lot of citizens think that nobody seems to leave their backgrounds behind when they start a new life in the U.S. How does this affect the view of migrants coming into the country?
I've got my own thoughts on that. Start?
Please, Barbara, go ahead.
So look, I mean, if you know, if you're a student of American history, and I'm an amateur on that, but I do like to go back and look at American history periodically to kind of better understand the impulses of today. You know, we are both a nation of immigrants and a nation that has struggled regularly with anti-immigrant sentiment percolating into the national political sphere, frequently visible, available at the local sphere, and often, you know, yesterday's immigrants are the ones dumping on today's immigrants. You know, so it's not necessarily you know, from those who have been here for 400, their forebears came 400 years ago. So, you know, whether it was on the, you know, in the 1850s, you know, lashing out at the Irish, at Catholics, virulent anti-Catholic sentiment, et cetera. We've had this always percolating in our DNA. Unfortunately, it's a strange fact of our history. I don't think, but the other side of it, the good side of it, is we've always had this sort of assimilation, you know, organic wheel assimilation. That the children of immigrants desperately want to be considered as just American, not Italian American, not Irish American, not any hyphenated American, and they learn English and they refuse to speak their mother tongue to their parents' chagrin, etc. I think what's happened is we've had a boiling up of this again. Steve touched on the historical human reflexes that come with pandemics. You can put the same historical human reflexes in times of economic downturn and stress, or at pivot points in great sort of wrenching technology-driven economic change and so forth, where people feel left behind and they want to blame somebody. And it's always easier, logical to fix on the others. So whether it's, you know, the Jews, the Catholics, the, you know, the non-Irish lace Catholics or what have you. And it's been lashed and whipped up into a froth, unfortunately, in the presidential campaign in 2015 to 16, and frankly by our, you know, the sitting president. This too will pass, in my view. It fused with all the other events of the last 19 years and September 11th, and then, as David noted, the surge of migrant flows that began in the 2000s and then really spiked with Libya and Syria descending into chaos. So it's a toxic brew, but I don't think it's so much a fear of whether those immigrants become a lobby. That's a kind of niche issue. I think it's just a desire to blame the other.
So from what I understand, thank you for your answer, firstly. And from what I understand, and this has been going on since the foundation of the US, and the recent problems and the trauma left from the, you know, negative things like the terrorism and all has just ignited it a little more. Okay, well, that kind of answers my question, I think. Okay, yeah, thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much. And I think now that we're at 12:04, I think we've kind of reached our time, and I want to be respectful. I know everyone has their busy schedules. Just want to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you, to our panelists. Thank you for joining us and sharing your time and expertise. It's so wonderful to have you. And for all of our attendees, thank you. We will be sharing the link of this recording following the event. I'll make sure to send it all. We're going to be sending a survey. So for all of you who's joined us, please let us know. This really helps us calibrate our programs and areas that we might be able to even improve or things you would like to see more of. It really does help with our future planning. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and hopefully we'll see you on one of our other events again soon.